It was a quiet neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. Rows of modest houses lined the streets, trimmed lawns, barbecues on weekends, kids riding their bikes home before dark, the picture of American suburban peace. And right in the middle of it all stood John Wayne Gacy's house, neat, cheerful, and always buzzing with activity. To the neighbors, he was the kind of man every community wanted, always smiling, always lending a hand. He hosted block parties, volunteered for local charities, and even dressed up as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and fundraisers. If someone's pipe burst, Gacy was there with his tools. If a local event needed chairs or decorations, he had them ready in his van. To everyone around him, he was the embodiment of friendliness, a man who made others feel safe. But beneath that charming smile lay something unspeakable. No one suspected the darkness hiding behind those painted walls. When people looked at Gacy, they saw a hard-working businessman, owner of a successful construction company called PDM Contractors. He had money, connections, and political ambition. He shook hands with local politicians, posed for photos with the mayor, and was often described as a model citizen. But at night, when the laughter faded and the streets grew silent, Gacy's other world came alive, one built on manipulation, power, and death. It's easy, in hindsight, to wonder how no one saw it. But that's what made John Wayne Gacy so terrifying. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like your neighbor, your boss, your uncle at the barbecue. Evil didn't wear a mask. It wore a smile. People in the community admired his generosity. He employed young men who were struggling, offering them jobs, cash, and guidance. Some even called him a father figure. But many of those same boys, teenagers and young men would vanish without a trace. Families searched desperately, putting up missing posters, calling police stations, praying for any lead. Yet each case seemed isolated. Chicago was a big city and runaways were common. No one connected the dots. Meanwhile, Gacy kept up appearances, always confident, always friendly. He attended church events, donated to local causes, and spoke with pride about his achievements. His friends described him as ambitious, driven, maybe a little eccentric, but harmless. The truth, though, was far more sinister. Inside his home, Gacy had built his kingdom of control. The crawl space beneath his house, dark, damp, and narrow, would later be revealed as a burial ground. But in 1970 Chicago, no one could have imagined such horror existing just below the floorboards of an ordinary suburban house. The deception was masterful. He lived a double life so perfectly balanced that even those closest to him had no idea who he truly was. There were glimpses, flashes of anger, moments of odd behavior, but people brushed them off. After all, everyone had quirks. And Gacy knew exactly how to hide behind charm and authority. He had learned long ago how to wear masks, not just the painted one of his clown persona, but the invisible mask of normalcy. When police pulled him over once for a minor violation, he smiled and joked, and they let him go. When employees questioned strange smells from the crawl space, he blamed it on a plumbing leak. Every lie was smooth, confident, believable. The illusion worked because people wanted to believe it. They wanted to trust the man who helped at the community fair, who showed up in a clown suit to make children laugh. Who could ever imagine that the same man, the one shaking hands at parades, would return home to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty? For years, he blended in, living two lives that never seemed to cross, until one day, they did. A single disappearance, a curious detective, and a trail that would soon unravel one of the darkest stories in American history. But in 1970 Chicago, no one could see it coming. The monster lived right next door, smiling, waving, and pretending to be one of them. That was the genius and the horror of John Wayne Gacy. He didn't just kill his victims. He killed trust itself. He proved that sometimes evil doesn't hide in shadows. Sometimes it lives in plain sight, behind a friendly face, beneath a suburban roof, in the house of the perfect neighbor, and soon, that perfect neighbor's world would begin to crack. Behind every mask lies a story, and behind John Wayne Gacy's ever-present smile was a past that could explain how charm turned into cruelty. To the world, Gacy was confident and sociable, but his early life painted a much darker picture, one of humiliation, rejection, and festering anger. He was born in 1942 in Chicago, the only son of a working-class family. From the outside, the Gacys looked ordinary, his father a World War I veteran, his mother a homemaker. But inside that small house, love was a rare visitor. His father, John Stanley Gacy, ruled with a heavy hand and a heavier temper. He mocked his son relentlessly, calling him weak, worthless, not man enough. As a child, Gacy was sickly and often stayed home, falling behind in school. That only made things worse. Each time his father saw him fail, he saw it as proof that his son would never be strong. He beat him, insulted him, and taught him one lesson above all: never let anyone see you weak. Gacy craved approval, especially from the man who despised him. He tried everything, working hard, obeying rules, even joining social clubs later in life, always chasing the validation that never came. That desire to be liked, to be admired, would shape everything he became. As he grew older, that need for control and acceptance merged into something dangerous. By his late teens, Gacy had already learned how to manipulate people, using flattery, kindness, and charm to get what he wanted. He could read people like an open book, knowing exactly what to say to make them trust him. It was his greatest weapon, and eventually his mask. But beneath that charm, his inner world was fractured. Gacy wrestled with his own identity and impulses, feelings he couldn't understand, let alone control. The more he suppressed them, the stronger they grew, twisting inside him like a coiled spring. In his early 20s, he left Chicago, desperate for a fresh start. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, then to Iowa, where he joined the Jaycees, a civic organization filled with young, ambitious men. For the first time, he felt important. He was praised for his enthusiasm, his leadership, his ability to bring people together. Finally, Gacy had found what he'd been craving since childhood: admiration. But it didn't last. Behind the community meetings and charity events, his darker side began to surface. Gacy started preying on younger boys, exploiting his position of trust to lure them in. In 1968, his facade cracked. He was arrested and charged with the sexual assault of a teenage boy. His image as the perfect citizen crumbled overnight. In court, Gacy denied everything, smiling confidently as if his charm could talk his way out of any crime. But this time it didn't work. He was convicted and sent to prison. His father died shortly after, never forgiving him, and Gacy never forgiving himself. Most people would see prison as rock bottom, but for Gacy, it became a training ground. He studied human behavior, learned how to earn favor with guards and fellow inmates, and rebuilt his reputation inside the walls. By the time he was released after serving just 18 months, he had mastered his manipulation skills. When he returned to Chicago in 1970, no one saw an ex-convict. They saw a man determined to start over, friendly, hardworking, respectable. He buried his criminal past beneath layers of good deeds and smiles. He got married, bought a house, started his own business, and joined local organizations again. To everyone around him, Gacy had turned his life around. But beneath that fresh start, the monster hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. The humiliation of his childhood, the rejection from his father, the time spent behind bars, all of it had hardened him. He had learned that power wasn't just about control. It was about perception. If he could make people believe in his innocence, he could get away with anything. That was the beginning of John Wayne Gacy's double life, the perfect neighbor by day and something far darker by night. As the years went on, he became more confident, more daring. He began hiring young men through his contracting business, using the same charm and kindness that had fooled everyone before. To them, he was a mentor, a friend. They had no idea they were stepping into the orbit of a predator who had spent years perfecting his disguise. By the mid-1970s, Gacy's mask was flawless, his laughter infectious, his words persuasive, his image untouchable. But behind those smiling eyes, the darkness was stirring again. The man who wanted love was long gone. What remained was a man who wanted control, complete, absolute control. And soon, Chicago would learn what happened when that mask finally slipped. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary Chicago suburb, minus 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. White siding, neatly trimmed lawn, an American flag fluttering gently at the porch. If you passed by, you'd never suspect the horrors buried beneath its floors. This was John Wayne Gacy's castle. To his neighbors, it was the home of a cheerful, hard-working man. The kind who hosted barbecues, lent tools, and waved to kids on their bikes. He was John, the friendly contractor, the guy who dressed up as Pogo the Clown for children's hospitals, who volunteered at charity events, who was always ready with a joke. But inside, the walls held secrets, and the air carried a stench that never quite went away. At first, no one noticed. It was just an odd smell that drifted into the yard now and then. Gacy explained it easily. A plumbing problem, he said. Maybe a dead animal under the house. The neighbors accepted it. After all, Gacy was one of them, respectable, generous, even popular. That was his greatest disguise. The house's basement was his private world, a place where no one was allowed without his permission. Beneath the concrete floors lay narrow crawl spaces, cramped and cold. Few ever saw them, and those who did never forgot. It was in that basement that Gacy, as two lives collided, the smiling clown and the silent killer. By 1972, young men started disappearing around Chicago, teenagers mostly. Some were hitchhikers, others were job seekers looking for a few extra bucks. Police assumed they were runaways. No one suspected that many of them had walked into Gacy's home and never walked out again. He had a method, one he rehearsed like a performance. He'd charm his victims, offering them work, a drink, maybe even show them his clown tricks. The handcuff trick was his favorite. "You can't get out unless I let you," he'd say, smiling. It was a joke until it wasn't. Once the cuffs clicked, the laughter ended. The boys' confusion would turn to panic. That's when Gacy's mask would slip completely. The friendly neighbor vanished, replaced by the man who spent years mastering control over fear, over pain, over life itself. When it was over, he'd bury the bodies in the crawl space. If the ground was too full, he'd move them to the backyard or throw them in the nearby river. Then he'd shower, shave, put on his clown makeup, and go back to being John, the man who everyone loved. And no one knew. Friends dropped by often. They sit in his living room, unaware of the horror beneath their feet. Even his employees, young men who worked for his construction business, had no idea that some of their coworkers had vanished, their names erased, their voices silenced forever. But the house itself began to betray him. The odor grew stronger. Visitors mentioned it, sometimes jokingly. One guest even said it smelled like death. Gacy laughed it off, his plumbing excuse always ready. Still, his behavior was becoming erratic. He drank more, slept less, and his temper grew unpredictable. Behind the jokes, there were moments of cold silence, when his eyes went dark, when his charm cracked for just a second. By 1975, people had started to notice that Gacy's name appeared often in missing persons reports, too often to be coincidence. But without bodies, the police had nothing to hold him on. Gacy knew that, and he enjoyed it. He was convinced he was smarter than everyone else. He hosted dinner parties for politicians, posed for photos with local officials, and played Pogo the Clown at parades, painting his smile wider and wider as if mocking the world for not seeing what was right in front of them. Every time he killed, he was reliving something, the control his father had denied him, the humiliation of prison, the rejection of a world that once called him weak. In that basement, he wasn't powerless anymore. He was judge, jury, and executioner. By 1978, more than 20 young men had vanished around Chicago. Parents filed reports, friends asked questions, and whispers began to spread. Still, Gacy smiled through it all. He truly believed he would never be caught. His house remained quiet, his basement undisturbed, the ground below heavy with secrets. But the walls were closing in. Soon, a single mistake, one missing boy too many, would bring everything crashing down. The house of laughter, charity, and neighborhood parties would soon become something else entirely, a house of death. And when police finally broke through the layers of concrete, they would uncover one of the most chilling crime scenes in American history. The friendly neighbor's mask was about to shatter, and the world was about to see what had been hiding behind that smile all along. By late 1978, Chicago's newspapers were filled with familiar headlines. Another teenage boy missing. Faces of smiling young men stared back from posters taped to lampposts and bus stops. Students, workers, dreamers, all gone without a trace. Their families waited by the phone every night, hoping for news that never came. At first, police treated the cases separately. Chicago was a big city. People disappeared all the time, especially young men. Maybe they'd run away, maybe joined the circus, maybe just started a new life somewhere else. But the mothers knew better. Something was wrong. One of those mothers was Elizabeth Piest. Her 15-year-old son, Robert, wasn't the kind to run away. He was responsible, polite, and close to his family. On the evening of December 11, 1978, Robert had finished his shift at the local pharmacy. He told his mom he'd be back in a few minutes. A man had offered him a construction job nearby. That man was John Wayne Gacy. Robert never came home. Elizabeth's world shattered that night. She reported him missing immediately. The police began their routine questioning, friends, co-workers, neighbors. That's when they heard Gacy's name. He was known in the area, ran a successful contracting business, and had even done some work for local politicians. The officers thought it was a dead end. But something about his calmness didn't sit right. When investigators visited Gacy, he greeted them with his trademark smile. He was confident, even helpful. He said he'd never seen the boy and had been busy at a holiday party that night. The detectives left, but one of them, Detective Joseph Kozinchak, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. So they started digging. They discovered that Gacy had a criminal record, a conviction for sexual assault on a teenage boy back in Iowa years earlier. That changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just another friendly contractor. This was a man with a dark past, one that perfectly fit the pattern of the missing boys. Detectives put him under surveillance. They followed him day and night, taking notes as he moved through the city, visiting diners, construction sites, and late-night bars. Gacy seemed unfazed. He even waved at the police tailing him, mocking them. He was confident they'd find nothing. But the more they watched, the stranger he became. He was erratic, sleeping in his car, making random detours at night, meeting young men and disappearing for hours. Once, he invited the officers for breakfast, joking that they should just arrest him already. He was playing a game, and he thought he was winning. Then came the search warrant. It was December 13, 1978. Officers entered his home, expecting to find clues about Robert Piest. What they found was something else, something deeply unsettling. Inside, the house felt ordinary at first. Photos of Gacy with local leaders hung proudly on the wall. The living room was clean, almost sterile. But then came the small details: a strange odor, empty wallets, driver's licenses belonging to different young men, and a class ring engraved with initials that didn't match Gacy's. In the crawl space, they noticed disturbed soil. Gacy brushed it off. Plumbing work, he said. The smell? Dead rats. He laughed about it. Still, the detectives left uneasy. A few days later, one of Gacy's employees told police something that broke the case open. Gacy had once mentioned burying bodies under his house. It had seemed like a joke at the time. Now it didn't. On December 21st, police brought Gacy in for questioning again. The pressure was mounting, his charm slipping. He drank heavily, muttering incoherently. The walls were closing in. Then suddenly he confessed not everything, not yet, but enough. He admitted to some killings, saying the rest were buried in a crawl space. The detectives were stunned. That same night, officers returned to 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, this time with shovels and lights. They dug through the crawl space, breaking through the cold, damp earth. Within minutes, a horrifying truth began to emerge. A human bone. Then another. Then the outline of a body. It wasn't one boy. It wasn't two. It was dozens. As word spread, Chicago fell silent. Neighbors gathered outside, weeping, praying. Reporters swarmed the street. The friendly clown, the generous neighbor, had become the face of one of America's most monstrous killers. The missing boys weren't missing anymore. They had been home all along, buried beneath the floors of Gacy's house, hidden beneath his perfect smile. And the house on Somerdale Avenue was no longer just a home. It had become a graveyard of innocence. December 22, 1978. Snow covered the streets of Chicago. But outside 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, the ground was alive with motion. Police officers, forensic experts, and reporters crowded the quiet suburban block. Flashing lights illuminated the small, unassuming house, the home of John Wayne Gacy. From the outside, it still looked ordinary. White siding, a trimmed lawn, Christmas lights hanging lazily from the roof. But inside, the air was thick, wrought with fear, with the unbearable weight of what lay beneath. Detectives had already found human remains in the crawl space, one body, then another. The search now was no longer for a missing boy. It was for the truth, and the truth was buried deep in the earth. The crawl space was dark, cramped, and suffocating. Officers had to crawl on their hands and knees through the cold, damp mud. Every few minutes, their shovels struck something, not rock, not pipe, but bone. At first, the police thought there might be 3, maybe 4 victims. But as the digging continued, that number kept rising, 6, then 10, then 15. The deeper they went, the more bodies they uncovered stacked almost on top of each other, like a macabre puzzle of human remains. Each discovery stunned the officers into silence. They weren't just finding bodies. They were uncovering the magnitude of evil itself. The medical examiner soon arrived, Dr. Robert Stein. Even he, a man accustomed to death, struggled to believe what he was seeing. Each skeleton told a story of horror, the bindings on wrists, the twisted positions, the shallow graves dug just inches apart. Some victims were still wearing clothing. Others were reduced to bone. Forensic teams marked the remains with small numbered flags. The crawl space began to look like a crime scene from a nightmare, a labyrinth of shallow graves beneath the floorboards of a friendly neighborhood clown. As the body count rose, Gacy sat in custody, eerily calm. He watched news reports about himself, eating breakfast as though nothing had happened. When detectives asked him why he did it, he shrugged and said, "I'm not sure. Maybe it was just business." Outside, the press called it the House of Horrors. Reporters described the smell that clung to their clothes, the haunting sight of bags being carried out, each containing the remains of another boy, another life stolen. Neighbors were in shock. They had eaten dinner with Gacy, attended his parties, even hired him to build their porches. None of them had suspected that beneath his house lay the remains of young men who had simply vanished from their own streets. As the digging continued into January, police found more evidence: clothing, personal items, jewelry, and driver's licenses. Many of the victims were identified through dental records. Others remained nameless for decades. Gacy's house became a crime scene that never seemed to end. Detectives spent weeks unearthing bodies, each one a grim testament to the monster hiding behind a smile. In total, they found 29 victims beneath his home. But the horror didn't stop there. When investigators realized there was no more space left under the crawl space, Gacy had started disposing of bodies elsewhere. Some were thrown into the Des Plaines River, wrapped in plastic bags and weighed down with rocks. The scale of the murders was almost incomprehensible. Each victim had been lured to his home, offered a job, a drink, or simply trust. Then, once inside, Gacy would perform his handcuff trick, pretending to show a magic act before turning it deadly. He called it the rope trick, a cruel game that ended with a noose around the victim's neck. Police officers and forensic workers broke down more than once. Some had to be replaced because they couldn't bear to return underground. It was like digging through hell itself. By February 1979, all the bodies that could be recovered were exhumed. Gacy's house was stripped bare, the crawl space sealed and disinfected. But no one in Chicago could forget what had been uncovered there. Eventually, the city ordered the demolition of the house. Bulldozers tore down the walls where Gacy had laughed, entertained children, and hid his atrocities. In its place stood an empty lot, a silent memorial to the young man who had never come home. For weeks, families lined up outside the morgue, clinging to hope that their sons might be among those identified. For many, closure came with unbearable pain. For others, it never came at all. The unearthing of Gacy's crimes revealed more than just the remains of his victims. It revealed a dark truth about how evil can hide in plain sight, behind smiles, behind laughter, behind the mask of a perfect neighbor. The clown costume, the parties, the jokes, all of it had been a disguise. Beneath the grease paint was a predator who hunted innocence itself. When the final body was removed, the crawl space was empty. But for those who had seen what lay beneath, that darkness would never truly leave them. The House of Horrors had been emptied, but its echo would haunt America forever. After the horror beneath 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was revealed, America stood frozen in disbelief. How could the man who hosted charity parties, dressed as a clown for children, and shook hands with local officials, also be the same monster who buried dozens beneath his own home? The question that echoed through every headline, every courtroom, every conversation was simple, yet haunting. What was inside the mind of John Wayne Gacy? Psychiatrists, investigators, and journalists began to dig into his past, not for evidence, but for understanding. What they found was not the story of a sudden killer, but of a slow, silent creation of one. John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago, to a strict, volatile father and a gentle, submissive mother. His father, a World War I veteran, ruled the home with fists and insults. He called his son stupid and worthless, often beating him for the smallest mistakes. Even as a boy, Gacy longed for approval, but it never came. Each slap, each insult, carved a wound deep inside him. He learned to smile through humiliation, to hide pain behind politeness. By the time he was a teenager, the mask of charm was his greatest weapon. He wanted to be liked, desperately. And that desire, twisted by years of rejection, would later turn into manipulation and control. In his early 20s, Gacy worked hard to build the image of a respectable man. He married, joined local clubs, and even entered politics. He was magnetic, always the center of attention, always willing to help. Behind that charm, though, was a growing darkness. His first known crime came in the 1960s, when he lured a teenage boy into his car and assaulted him. When caught, he served time in prison, but even there, he behaved like a model inmate, charming, cooperative, and friendly. When released early for good behavior, Gacy promised to turn his life around. He moved back to Chicago, started his own contracting business, and built a new identity: hard-working businessman, generous neighbor, local clown performer. But inside, the old rage, the need to dominate, the thrill of control, had only grown stronger. Psychologists later described Gacy as a textbook sociopath, someone without empathy, guilt, or true emotion. He didn't kill because of impulse. He killed because it made him feel powerful. Each victim, usually young men who trusted him, became a canvas for his control. He played God, deciding who lived, who died, and where their remains would rest. But his duality was what terrified experts the most. He could commit unspeakable crimes at night and then shake hands with city officials in the morning. He attended church, managed his business, and performed as Pogo the Clown for children's parties, a grotesque contradiction that became his signature. One of the psychiatrists who studied him said Gacy didn't have two sides. He was both sides, the charming man and the killer, and he didn't see a difference. That's what made him so dangerous. He believed his lies so completely that even when faced with overwhelming evidence, he refused to see himself as a murderer. When questioned by police, Gacy would sometimes laugh, joke, or even flirt with his interrogators. He talked about his victims like they were accidents, mistakes, or things that got out of hand. He blamed the victims, the police, and even society. In his own mind, he was never guilty, only misunderstood. Later interviews revealed something even darker. Gacy claimed he was two people, John the kind neighbor and Jack, the violent killer. He said Jack did the killing, not him. But psychologists knew better. This wasn't a split personality. It was a performance. A desperate, chilling attempt to escape responsibility. He showed no remorse, no empathy, not even fear. When asked if he felt bad for the families of his victims, Gacy shrugged and said, "They're gone. What am I supposed to do about it?" By the time the trial approached, experts had concluded that John Wayne Gacy was not insane. He was coldly rational. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every abduction, every murder, every burial was planned. The monster wasn't hiding behind the man. The monster was the man. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. Because John Wayne Gacy wasn't he a shadow in an alley or a figure lurking in the dark. He was the man next door. The man who smiled at you, waved from his porch, offered to fix your fence. He was proof that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. By late 1978, the carefully constructed illusion of John Wayne Gacy, the friendly contractor, the cheerful clown, the man who could do no wrong, was beginning to crumble. For years, he had hidden behind a mask of charm and normalcy, deceiving his neighbors, friends, even the police. But every mask, no matter how perfect, eventually begins to crack. It started with a boy named Robert Piest, a 15-year-old who vanished on a cold December night in the Chicago suburb of Des Plaines. Robert was polite, hardworking, and full of dreams. He was saving money for college, planning his future, and helping his mother at a local pharmacy. On the evening of December 11, 1978, Gacy visited that pharmacy to discuss a potential remodeling job. Robert overheard him talking about high-paying work and mentioned he might speak to Gacy about a job opportunity. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. When Robert didn't return home, his mother panicked. She knew something was wrong. He wasn't the kind of boy to run away. She called the police immediately. But unlike Gacy's previous victims, Robert's disappearance didn't fade quietly into the shadows. This time the police took notice. And this time Gacy had made a fatal mistake. He had left a trail. Detective Joseph Kozinchak was assigned to the case. When investigators learned that Gacy was the last person to see Robert, they decided to question him. Gacy, as always, was polite and confident. He invited officers into his home, offered them coffee, and joked as if nothing were wrong. He explained that Robert had never come with him, insisting he must have gone somewhere else. His calmness almost worked, until the officers began digging deeper into his background. Soon, the picture of John Wayne Gacy, model citizen, began to distort. Records showed a previous conviction for sexual assault. Rumors surfaced about young men who had worked for Gacy and mysteriously disappeared. His contracting business, PDM Contractors, had hired dozens of teenage boys over the years, most of them drifters or runaways, easy to prey upon, easy to erase. The detectives decided to keep him under surveillance. For days, they followed him everywhere, from his job sites to his favorite diners. Gacy, sensing their presence, tried to play mind games. He would drive erratically, confront the officers, even invite them to breakfast. At times, he acted friendly. Other times, hostile. The pressure was building, and the once flawless mask was starting to slip. Inside his home, the walls seemed to close in. The smell of decay, something neighbors had long complained about, became harder to explain away. Gacy blamed clogged drains and mold, but the truth lay just beneath his floorboards. The surveillance intensified. Officers noticed Gacy's mood changing, from cocky to paranoid. He drank heavily, slept little, and rambled incoherently to friends. He told one acquaintance that the police were out to get him, and to another, "My life's over anyway." The man who once controlled everything was unraveling. On December 20th, police finally obtained a search warrant. When they entered his house, the stench hit them immediately. As they searched, an officer went into a small crawl space beneath the floor, and there, he saw it. Human remains. The mask had shattered completely. Gacy was arrested that same day, but even then he tried to maintain control. He told police he had nothing to do with the bodies, that maybe his employees had done it. But soon, under hours of relentless questioning, his stories began to fall apart. Late that night, exhausted and cornered, Gacy began to speak, not in confession, but in fragments, half-truths, and riddles. He admitted to burying a few people and said there were others in the river. Officers realized they were standing face to face with one of the most prolific killers in American history. In the days that followed, the full horror emerged. 29 bodies were found buried beneath and around his house. 4 more were discovered in the nearby Des Plaines River. Each was a story cut short. Boys who had dreams, families, and futures. When reporters gathered outside his home, neighbors wept in disbelief. They couldn't comprehend how the man who hosted block parties and entertained children as a clown had hidden a mass grave under his home. For years they had trusted him, smiled at him, laughed with him. Now they looked back with a sickening realization. They had been living beside a monster. Gacy's double life had finally collapsed under the weight of his own lies. The man who once controlled every narrative was now trapped in one of his own making, a story of horror, denial, and unimaginable evil. And for the first time, John Wayne Gacy's mask, the smile, the charm, the illusion, was gone. What remained was the face of a killer who had fooled the world for far too long. The year was 1980, and the city of Chicago was bracing for one of the most disturbing trials in American history. The man at the center of it all, John Wayne Gacy, sat calmly in court, wearing his trademark smirk. Behind that expression was a lifetime of deception, manipulation, and murder. But now he was no longer in control. For the first time, the world would hear the truth about what lay beneath his suburban home. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with reporters, psychologists, and families of the victims. Every seat was taken. Outside, crowds gathered, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had buried 29 young men and boys beneath his house and dumped 4 more into a river. They came not just out of curiosity, but out of disbelief. How could anyone so ordinary, so trusted, have committed crimes so monstrous? The prosecution painted Gacy as a cold-blooded killer, a predator who had used his charm to lure victims, torture them, and bury them under his very feet. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, rope fibers, rings and jewelry belonging to the missing boys, and Gacy's own chilling words during police interrogations. One detective recalled Gacy saying almost casually, "Clowns can get away with murder." The defense, however, had a different plan. They didn't deny the murders. That was impossible, but they claimed Gacy was legally insane. His lawyers described a man torn apart by multiple personalities, one kind, one cruel, one incapable of controlling the other. They said his mind was fractured, that he didn't understand right from wrong. To many in the courtroom, that defense felt like another manipulation, another mask. But to the jury, it raised a haunting question: could a man commit such evil and still be sane? Psychologists were called to testify. Some described Gacy as a sociopath, fully aware of his actions, driven by domination and control. Others claimed he was delusional, living in his own twisted reality. But the most powerful testimonies came not from experts, they came from the families. Mothers stood on the witness stand, holding photos of their sons. They described the endless nights of waiting, the unanswered phone calls, the hope that slowly turned into despair. Fathers spoke of guilt, how they searched, begged, and prayed, never realizing that their sons had been buried just miles away. Each story pierced through the courtroom like a blade. The air grew heavy. Even reporters found it hard to take notes as the magnitude of Gacy's crimes unfolded. And through it all, Gacy sat there, calm, detached, sometimes even laughing. When prosecutors showed photos of the victims, he looked away. When survivors' families broke down, he leaned back, arms crossed. It was as if he was watching a show he had once directed. The most shocking moment came when Gacy himself took the stand. With chilling composure, he spoke about his life, his business, and his good deeds. He denied being a monster. He blamed his employees, his upbringing, even the police. He claimed he had been misunderstood, that the press had turned him into something he wasn't. But every word only deepened the public's revulsion. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom was silent with anticipation. The prosecution reminded the jury of the sheer scale of the horror, 33 lives extinguished. They described the crawl space, the smell of decay, the victims' ages, their final moments. If this man is not sane, one attorney said, then no man ever was. The defense made one last plea, mercy. They argued that Gacy was mentally ill and deserved treatment, not death. But mercy had no place left in that room. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, voice trembling but firm. We find the defendant, John Wayne Gacy, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Gacy remained expressionless, his smirk finally gone. The judge looked him directly in the eyes and pronounced the sentence. Death by lethal injection. Reporters rushed to the phones. Outside, families hugged and cried. For them, it wasn't victory, it was closure. The man who had taken so much from them would finally face justice. But even in defeat, Gacy refused to repent. As guards led him away, he muttered, I still maintain my innocence. Those would become the words he'd repeat for the next 14 years, from his prison cell to every reporter who came to interview him. The trial of the century wasn't just about a killer. It was about a community's reckoning, a society forced to confront the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary face. And though the verdict was clear, the question lingered in the air long after the courtroom emptied. How many more monsters walk among us, still smiling behind their masks? The years that followed John Wayne Gacy's conviction were a strange mix of silence and spectacle. From behind the concrete walls of Menard Correctional Center, Gacy lived not as a broken man awaiting death, but as if he were still the star of his own twisted show. While most condemned men faded into despair, Gacy thrived on attention. He painted portraits of clowns, signed autographs, and granted interviews to anyone willing to listen. He became, in a dark way, a celebrity of evil. His paintings of Pogo the Clown sold for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of dollars. Collectors, true crime enthusiasts, and even morbid admirers wrote him letters, some asking for sketches, others offering sympathy. Gacy responded to nearly all of them, carefully crafting an image of himself as an ordinary man caught in extraordinary accusations. To the families of his victims, it was unbearable. While they mourned in silence, Gacy continued to mock justice. He joked with reporters, denied every murder, and claimed the state had framed him. In one interview, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, you can't kill me. I'm the 34th victim. The arrogance stunned everyone. Even after the mountain of evidence, the human remains under his house, the testimonies, his own contradictions, Gacy refused to take responsibility. He thrived on defiance. Every interview, every statement was a performance, as if he wanted to leave the world remembering him on his own terms. But time slowly and surely began to close in. His endless appeals were denied, one after another. By 1994, after 14 years on death row, Gacy's final execution date was set, May 10, 1994. As the news broke, families of victims gathered once again, not in fear this time, but in grim anticipation. For nearly 2 decades, they had waited for this day, carrying the unbearable weight of loss and anger. They hoped his execution would bring them peace, but even then, many admitted that nothing could truly fill the emptiness he had left behind. In his final weeks, Gacy continued to give interviews. He told one journalist, "I don't lose sleep over this. I sleep fine every night." When asked if he felt remorse, he snapped, "For what? Killing isn't my style." He even mocked the very idea of justice, saying, "The state's killing me. Who's the real murderer now?" For Gacy, it wasn't repentance, it was performance until the final act. On the night before his execution, guards observed him pacing his cell. He spent hours painting, then stopped to eat a cheeseburger, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, and a pound of strawberries, his last meal. He laughed with guards, cracked jokes, and signed a few last-minute autographs. There was no fear in his eyes, no trembling hands, only the same unnerving confidence he had worn his entire life. As midnight approached, a small crowd gathered outside the prison. Protesters held signs, some against the death penalty, others demanding vengeance. Inside, witnesses prepared to watch the end of one of America's most infamous killers. At 12:52 a.m., Gacy was escorted into the execution chamber. He wore a plain blue shirt and smiled faintly as he was strapped onto the gurney. The executioner inserted the fourth lines, and a doctor confirmed his identity. When asked if he had any final words, Gacy looked toward the witnesses' victims' families, journalists, and state officials, and smirked. His last words were simple, venomous, and unforgettable. "Kiss my ass." Moments later, the lethal injection began to flow, his breathing slowed. Within minutes, the man who had terrorized Chicago, who had buried boys beneath his home, who had mocked justice and played the victim, was gone. Outside the prison, a crowd of nearly 400 people cheered. Some held signs that read, "Justice for the victims." Others stood silently, tears streaming down their faces. Inside, the families finally exhaled, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Yet, even in death, Gacy's shadow lingered. His artwork continued to circulate in auctions. His name was mentioned in every discussion about serial killers and psychopathy. And his crimes, his mask of normalcy, became a chilling lesson for America. Evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and lives next door. For many, Gacy's death wasn't the end. It was merely a reminder of how far human darkness can reach when hidden behind a mask of charm and power. The man who had once painted himself as a clown, the man who entertained children and buried their peers beneath his floorboards, had finally faced his reckoning. But the horror he left behind, the broken families, the haunted survivors, the scarred city, would last far longer than his heartbeat. And as dawn broke over Illinois that morning, a sense of uneasy silence filled the air. Justice had been served, but peace still felt distant. Because how do you truly heal from a monster who smiled all the way to the end? Even after his death, John Wayne Gacy refused to disappear. His name still echoes through the corridors of American crime history, a reminder that true evil doesn't always hide behind masks of darkness. Sometimes it smiles right at you. For years after his execution in 1994, the world continued to grapple with one terrifying question. How could this man, this friendly contractor, this community clown, this respected neighbor commit such horrors? The idea that someone so ordinary could be capable of burying over 30 young men beneath his own home didn't just terrify America. It shattered its sense of security. In the 1970s, the United States was already drowning in chaos. Vietnam, Watergate, inflation, distrust. But Gacy's case hit somewhere deeper. It was the collapse of trust in the people next door. Parents began locking their doors tighter. Neighbors started looking at one another differently. The illusion of suburban safety, the very dream of middle-class America, cracked forever. When investigators looked back, they realized that the system had failed again and again. Gacy had been arrested before, accused of assaulting young boys in the 1960s, yet he was released early for good behavior. He rebuilt his life, moved to Chicago, started a business, and reinvented himself as the picture-perfect citizen. He hosted parties for politicians, organized neighborhood events, and even posed for photos dressed as Pogo the Clown, entertaining children, while beneath his house the floorboards hid an unimaginable horror. Gacy's story became a case study in the failure of oversight and the blind spots of society. The justice system, the police, even his community. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. A friendly face, not a predator. It exposed how evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it fits in perfectly. After his execution by lethal injection, Gacy's final words were chillingly defiant. "Kiss my ass." There was no remorse, no apology, only arrogance. Even in death, he wanted control. But the irony is that control slipped away long ago. In the years since, Gacy's crimes have been dissected by psychologists, criminologists, and even artists. His paintings, grotesque portraits of clowns and skulls, have sold for thousands of dollars, often bought by collectors obsessed with murderabilia. To some, they're macabre artifacts of history. To others, they're symbols of how our culture sensationalizes monsters while forgetting their victims. But perhaps the most haunting part of Gacy's legacy isn't his art or his infamy. It is the faces of those still unnamed. Even decades later, some of his victims remain unidentified. Each bone recovered from beneath his home told a story that ended too soon. Boys who ran away, who were forgotten, who trusted the wrong man. Modern DNA testing has helped return some of them to their families, but others still lie nameless in the cold archives of Cook County. Their silence is the true echo of Gacy's evil. Not his name, not his grin, but the lives he erased from history. In a broader sense, Gacy's crimes forced America to confront the psychology of the hidden predator. He wasn't insane in the chaotic, uncontrollable way many killers are portrayed. He was organized, manipulative, charming, what psychologists later define as the organized serial killer. His crimes inspire studies, documentaries, and even reforms in investigative procedures. The FBI's behavioral science unit used cases like his to build modern criminal profiling, the very methods that now catch serial offenders before they strike again. So in a dark twist, Gacy's evil ended up shaping the tools used to stop future monsters. And yet, every time his story is told, a question lingers in the air. Could there be another Gacy among us? That fear, that unsettling doubt, is the true legacy he left behind. Because Gacy wasn't a ghost in an alley or a nameless stranger in the dark. He was a man you might have hired to build your porch, a man who smiled at your children, a man who seemed safe. His story warns us not to mistake charm for goodness, or a smile for a soul. It reminds us that evil isn't always born in the shadows. Sometimes it grows in the light of ordinary lives. Today, the house on 8213 West Somerdale Avenue is gone, demolished, erased, its soil replaced with fresh grass. New families live there now, unaware that beneath their feet once lay the resting place of dozens of lost souls. But memory doesn't vanish so easily. Every brick that was torn down carried whispers of a horror that defied imagination. In the end, the tale of John Wayne Gacy is not just about murder. It is about the masks people wear, the blindness of society, and the cost of ignorance. It's a warning that still stands, as chilling as ever. The most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look just like us.